Scoot back with me back to verse 17, actually. I want to focus on something that's really cool. We might jump to a couple of different passages. Verse 17, it says, so that Christ may what? Dwell in your hearts. This word for dwelling is a really important word when it comes to how we view the Bible. Now, I want to do a little bit of biblical history for you, okay? So remember we talked about the temple a couple of weeks ago and where you worship and all this stuff? Well, before the temple, after the Exodus, so think of they cross the Red Sea, right? They're wandering in the wilderness. While they're in the wilderness, they create what is called not the temple, but starts with a T, tabernacle, okay? The tabernacle. This is a fancy word, tabernacle, which literally means kind of like the presence to gather together, or to meet with, right? So think of tabernacle as to meet with. And so they create the tabernacle, and that's where God's presence resided back then. And so when they would go to the tabernacle, it was kind of where God was. And they made it movable because remember, they're in the wilderness. They haven't got to Israel yet. They haven't got back home and built the temple. So God's presence was in the tabernacle. God met and dwelt with them. And so I'm going to read a passage for you. It's in Exodus 40:34. This is when the completion of the tabernacle happened. We learn all about the dimensions and how it was built and what it looked like in Exodus. But at the end of the book of Exodus, chapter 40, verse 34, this is the last paragraph of Exodus when the tabernacle was completed. This is what it says. So think of this is the Lord meeting with his people. That's what tabernacle means. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Throughout all their journeys, whenever the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the people of Israel would set out. But if the cloud was not taken up, then they did not set out till the day that it was taken up. For the cloud of the Lord was on the tabernacle by day, and fire was it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. Okay, so that's kind of God being present in the tabernacle. There was a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That's kind of how they met with God. Well, we also see, so that was the tabernacle, okay, historically speaking. Once they get into Israel and they're done with the Exodus and they make it to Jerusalem, they build the temple. Okay, so tabernacle and temple are a little bit different. Tabernacle, think temporary, and then temple, think permanent. Okay, the temple was where they went to make sacrifices and meet with God in that sort of way. This was permanent. God's permanent dwelling place. Permanent. Whoops. Sorry, there's a meaning behind all of this. Okay, I'm a nerd. But maybe you'll nerd out with me later. I don't know, permanent. I can't spell it right now. My nose is stuffy. And at the end of Second Chronicles 5:13, we see the finished construction of the tabernacle. 2 Chronicles 5:13. Let me read this for you. This is when they finished building the temple. Verse 13. And it was the duty of the trumpeters, is it 2 Chronicles? And it was the duty of the trumpeters and singers to make themselves heard in unity and praise and thanksgiving to the Lord. And when the song was raised with trumpets and cymbals and other musical instruments in praise to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. The house of the Lord was what? Filled with a cloud, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. Notice that when the tabernacle was finished, Moses was unable to enter, and when the temple was finished, the priests were unable to enter, showing God's holy presence. So this is the second time that it shows God tabernacling or meeting with his people. The third time that this word is used is not in the Old Testament, but it's in John 1:14. Somebody open up to John 1:14. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in the New Testament. Somebody, whoever gets there first, somebody hand the mic to them. This is good news, guys. This is cool. It's all going to come together. Stand up and read for everybody, please. John 1:14, everybody. The mic's on, right? It's on. It just doesn't amplify sound, but it does take in the sound.
Okay. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Okay, see that? And the Word, meaning Jesus, became flesh and what? Dwelt among us. That's the same word that's used in our passage in Ephesians 3. That's good news. In the tabernacle, how lame would that be? From our perspective as Christians, we have the Spirit living in us, and he lives in us permanently. Back then, it was like, okay, not to contain the Lord, but the Lord's presence is in the tabernacle, and then it's in the temple. But now, the Word became flesh, and he tabernacles with us. I know it's a weird word. I never understood this. Even during Bible college, I was like, what does tabernacle mean? It means to meet with. And so what John 1:14 says is the Lord, instead of being in places that were built by brick and mortar or by linens and other materials, he says, no, he came in the flesh and tabernacled and met with us and dwells with us. That's the good news of Christ coming as man, as a human, instead of just being this distant building. And so that's what Paul is getting at here in having the Lord dwell and settle down. Other translations say he settles down in us. It's kind of like when you get a new house. How many of you have moved into a new house before? It takes a while. You unpack things, you sit in a new chair or an old bed or whatever, and then your room finally feels like home. That's the kind of dwelling, settling down that it's talking about when it comes to the Spirit or Christ living in our hearts. He settles down in us. Isn't that cool? Like the God of the universe settles down in our hearts, and we could just rest in that. That's the prayer that Paul is praying for the church in Ephesus, and it's a prayer that I pray for you guys. My job, yes, it's to teach, it's to preach and open up the Bible and teach you that. But my hope for all of you is that Christ would dwell and settle down in your hearts so that you would know that you are saved and you would be empowered by the Spirit. This is a pastoral prayer that not only pastors should preach to their people, I like teaching this to you, but I think it's a prayer that you should have for your friends who don't know Christ. You should pray that Christ would settle down in their hearts and that he would use you to introduce them to him.